Everyone knows about the Three Musketeers, the heroes of the Dumas novels. But of course, we picture them fighting with swords, which of course they did because they were used to, on the battlefield, to firing 1 or 2 shots and then defending themselves with swords. Early firearms were expensive, they were complicated, they required extensive training to use, and they were very slow to load. The innovation that made the musket effective was the bayonet, which came into common use in the second quarter of the 18th century, so only about 50 years before the War of the American Revolution. The bayonet made it possible for a musket to be loaded and fired once or twice and then used as a pike. Pike had been the common infantry weapon of the 17th century, so there wasn't a great deal of change in the way infantry tactics were used on the battlefield. Mass muskets armed with bayonets would be the principal battlefield weapon of infantry through the Napoleonic Wars and then beyond into the American Civil War. Certainly the major weapon of our Revolutionary War and of the War of 1812. Now, to fire a musket, you have to have gunpowder. And gunpowder is a complicated, by early modern standards, chemical product. It consists of 3 things: charcoal, sulfur, and potassium nitrate, or what is commonly called saltpeter. These become vitally important strategic minerals in the 18th century. Now, there wasn't a lot of potassium nitrate in America. When George Washington took command of the Continental Army in June of 1775, there was only about 80,000 pounds of gunpowder available to him, less than 400 tons total in all of the colonies. And that gunpowder wouldn't carry the war effort more than a year, Washington knew. America needed to learn how to manufacture gunpowder. It needed to capture gunpowder from the British, who were bringing it in across the sea, and they needed to find foreign sources of gunpowder. And ultimately, all 3 were important in the American war effort. Washington sent out privateers and Massachusetts Navy ships to intercept British supply ships bringing gunpowder into the colonies. And that was one useful source of gunpowder for America. Another was domestic manufacturing. Continental Congress sent out pamphlets and instructions to all of the states explaining how saltpeter, the principal ingredient in gunpowder, could be produced. To prosecute the war, they ultimately relied on the French. Now, French gunpowder began to arrive in the colonies in the summer of 1776, and it's a good thing that it did because Washington was essentially out of powder. The powder that was used to defend New York City, and then subsequently in the failed defense of Philadelphia, Brandywine, and Germantown, that powder was French powder. This was actually a good thing for the Americans because French powder was the best gunpowder made in the world. The French used advanced chemistry. French gunpowder had more hitting force and longer range than British gunpowder. So the British officers, when they were confronted with American troops firing French gunpowder, knew it because the American muskets were able to reach them at a greater distance than they could fire and hit the Americans. This was an enormous advantage for the American troops firing French gunpowder. And the British were severely disappointed when they would capture American stores of gunpowder and find the fleur-de-lis emblem burned into the side of the powder kegs, knowing that powder had come from French arsenals. The end of the war, America's reliance on French gunpowder was almost complete. Probably 75% of the gunpowder Americans used at the siege of Yorktown was French gunpowder, perhaps even more. It was absolutely vital. This strategic resource, gunpowder, had to be obtained laboriously in the colonies, had to be manufactured at home, captured from the British, or acquired from the French. And ultimately, it was the French who provided the gunpowder that won American independence.